This is Greg Daddis, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
First, I got to give apologies to Greg because I was on the road yesterday and didn't have all my gear set up, and then I had a super crowded morning. So not only did I have him wait 30 minutes, then I made him sit and watch me for 15 minutes while we get things set up. So my apologies. Thank you. I hope it's worth it for you, because I want to have this great chat with you about all of this stuff that is about combat, but relates to today. And as we look back at what the Department of War is, et cetera, all this stuff. It's going to be real fun. So Greg's book, I'll put the link up here. There it is right there. I'll put it in the remarks in a second here. Thanks for coming on the show, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Pete. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. All right. So what is our relationship with war?
Dysfunctional. I think, and that really, it was the genesis for the book I wanted to write was answering that very somewhat simple, but then became very complicated question of what has our relationship with war been like since 1945. And what I wanted to do was take a look at answering that question less from a international systems approach or an IR theory approach, and more of an emotional study of our relationship with war. And in many ways, since the aftermath of World War II, at the end of 1945, we have had a very emotional relationship with war. And as I kind of studied it as a historian, what I found over and over again was this tension between a faith in and a fear of war. And that played out over and over and over again during the Cold War era. And I would argue it's a tension that we're still kind of wrestling with today.
Yeah. Is the modern version of war harder than the 1945 era?
No, I just think the challenge set is different, right? I think, if you go back and look at the immediate aftermath of World War II, there are some who say there was this immense break in time, right? At 1945, we dropped 2 atomic bombs, and we are now entering into a brand new atomic age. And the complications of that politically, diplomatically, militarily, I think were some of the most challenging of the post-World War II era, of just basics of how to survive on a nuclear battlefield, how to fight on a nuclear battlefield. What was the purpose of war? Was it to defeat your enemy, or was it to deter more war? And so I think we're clearly facing challenges today in terms of cyber and unmanned aerial aircraft. But I don't know if it's more difficult. I think it's just the challenge set is different.
Yeah, for sure. When we had World War I followed fairly closely by World War II, people got sick of that kind of fighting, for the most part. Like it cured a lot of it for a long time. And then you add the atomic element, and we've done our best to kind of keep the lid on the atomic bomb, nuclear bomb scenarios. But, we're also desperate to make Russia as wobbly and as unstable as possible. And they've got a lot of nuclear bombs. That doesn't make a lot of sense in the big world when you talk to me about this. As we try to figure out what we're trying to do, it does seem that like lifting the condition of people is one of the obvious desires, but it proves out that that's really hard to do as well.
Yeah.
So it is not war is not a comfortable thing, but I don't know that we've gotten any better at figuring out how to accomplish these complex goals.
No, and there is a moment in time during the Cold War, probably the late 50s, early 60s, where as we move from the Eisenhower years and thinking about the potential for nuclear Armageddon, and Eisenhower would say over and over again, I want to fight limited wars that don't escalate into general war. And by general war, he meant atomic war. And then there was this transition to the Kennedy administration, and you start to see war hopefully being used to build up nations. And there is a sense here that the use of military force, when it's combined with other social economic development programs and efforts, can help nation building. And that then leads us into places like Southeast Asia, and ultimately to the long war in Vietnam. And there's this assumption that social and economic development becomes almost indivisible from the use of military power, which I find really fascinating, right? That there is this kind of counterintuitive thinking that war breaks things And yet the idea or the hope was that you would break communist influence and then from that build something more stable, something more pro-American, and then something that would give the United States access regionally, whether it's access to raw material or access to alliances in the region that would further contest the spread of communism. And so, what you end up having is this kind of Marshall version of what was called back then modernization theory, right? That the idea that the United States could steward what folks like Walt Rostow would call traditional societies and steward them along this upward slope. And basically, if they followed in the footsteps of the United States, they too would become like us. And those types of assumptions that were very much laced into our ideas about the use of military force, I think, lead us into the ultimate quagmire that is Vietnam.
Right. It seems like our if we scope back beyond theory, like we can start to see that, hey, like it went pretty good the last 80 years. We did get a lot of places more stabilized than they might have been otherwise. Maybe, we'll never know that. But
yeah,
South Korea is a stable place. There's a lot of Europe has, was rebuilt and caught up pretty quickly. A lot of it did work, but did it work good enough? And I guess we would have to say no.
And I think when you expand out like beyond places like Japan and Korea, which are always the, you remember during the counterinsurgency days, right? Those were the two historical examples that every counterinsurgent wanted to bring up was, well, look what we did in Korea, look what we did in Japan.
Right.
But when you expand the lens out to places like Latin America, Africa, throughout Southeast Asia, the Cold War was an incredibly violent phase in human history. Yes, it was stable for the most part in Europe, but when you kind of expand out, as Paul Chamberlain calls it, the Cold War killing fields are pretty bloody.
Yeah. The counterinsurgency thing, you're right. Like any kind of social theory, we're going to look at the Nordic countries and say, wow, look at that. They've done it. And like, well, they've got 90+% one ethnicity, and so a little more community might allow for a little more like we struggle with the concept that diversity and unity are not perfect antonyms, but they're antonyms. And so if you want diversity, it's at the expense of university. And university is brutal when you have too much of that. And so
and you see that in the 1990s, right, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, where many in the Clinton administration, to include Madeleine Albright, are saying that, look, we slayed the Soviet dragon, and now we're really concerned about what she and others called these snakes that were now bubbling up, basically ethnic rivalries in former Eastern European Soviet satellites. And so there was this intense fear in the aftermath of the Cold War that exactly what you're saying, these diverse ethnicities that would almost immediately, now that the boot of communism was taken off of those countries, led to ethnic rivalries and a heck of a lot of bloodshed in places like Bosnia, Herzegovina, and other places.
Yeah, Bosnia. Is there a way that we walk through that whole conflict without it going the way it did? I mean, Tito was among the most powerful, and I guess by that regard, successful leaders in the post-World War II era, right? And so who I mean, they can't agree today on things. There's not even a Macedonia to go with the North Macedonia. Like it's all crazy to try to decide how we're going to manage all these things.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're clearly dealing with the consequences of that today, right? That both the first Bush administration and the two Clinton administrations were arguing for an expansion of NATO because it seemed to be the safest solution to stabilize Eastern Europe and deal with all of these ethnic rivalries that were brewing up, bubbling up, perhaps, as you suggest, almost inevitably, right? That there was, I mean, as a historian, I hate to use the word inevitable, right? But
it is what happened.
But in many ways, I mean, this is the consequence of those ethnic rivalries, which then led to calls for an expansion of NATO, despite people like Yeltsin saying we need to be careful with this. And now we're obviously seeing the consequences of that today.
Yeah, boy. I mean, that particular conflict, as we've pulled back in time, the complexity was incomprehensible.
Hey, Pete, I got to tell you, so, you know, that was probably one of the hardest things I had to conceptualize in my own head, was doing research for the chapter on the wars in the 1990s. Holy crap, is it complicated? I mean, you know, just trying to move things on a map and get a sense who's who and who's fighting for who, and what the objectives are. It was an absolute mess. Yeah. And trying to just explain it to, you know, the average American, I think was probably a difficult, if not, you know, impossible task in and of itself.
Did you deploy to Bosnia at all?
I did not. I had a lot of close friends that did. You know, my best man at my wedding I was serving in the Virginia National Guard, went over. You know, so this was a kind of total force package effort from the United States. And in many ways, I don't think Americans really even understood why we were there, what we were there for. And from an organizational standpoint, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the United States Army in particular has no idea what its identity is, right? Are we a peacemaking force? Are we a peacekeeping force? What is our mission coming out of the Cold War? And there is this kind of existential questioning that's occurring from an organizational standpoint that I would argue doesn't really get resolved until 9/11.
There's a lot in what you just said. I deployed, and it's the only conflict I know of in history where it was led by a bunch of guys like me. It was all spies on the ground, and we were augmented by, get this, everybody, interrogators who normally don't leave the post ever.
Right.
And they were out on patrols going, what am I doing out here? This is not their, you know, they're waiting for someone to come through the Sally port. Like, no, we're going to go out into town. And just to be, we were the main effort. My unit was the main effort. We were the counterintelligence force. And so we deployed all over the battlefield, and we had no idea what we were doing. Right. I mean, we have people that were seasoned in certain operations in counterintelligence, but most of the warrant officers were, how do we defeat the Russians, right? And now Russians were our partners. And you talk about complexity. Right. Like, they're going to become part of NATO. Are they really? And we were deployed right next to Russia, like in a combined kind of area. So very complex. And then you go talk to the locals, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm a Serbo-Croatian guy, but my grandfather was Bosniak.
Right.
Like, what? How does that work? Well, his grandfather was a Serbian.
Right.
Like, okay. All right. Who are you mad at?
Right.
And then we're making these black and white decisions, and I'm being unfair to us, but it's very complex to know who did what. And you're talking about false flags. That's a great place to do it, because you just point at the guy you want to point at, and then that problem was real. And so when that's the truth on the ground, that it's extremely hard to understand what's going on in a short amount of time, which a year is just a short amount of time in these cases. I still don't even know what.
Saw that in Afghanistan too, right? Where local rivalries were implanted on top of the U.S. occupation, and then, you know, a warlord that had a family, you know, riff with somebody else could use the U.S. counter-terrorist force to say, hey, this guy here is actually part of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, and use the military presence as a way to deal with their own local issues that may have been decades generational.
Yeah, and you said Afghanistan, Iraq too, though. Like, there's a bad man over there. His name's Mohammed. He's wearing sandals. He's got a mustache. He's going to kill people.
Right.
Oh, whoa. We would run. We would run to that fight, and we didn't understand the condition of things. So is that a normal thing for the military? Do we do the same thing in Vietnam? Do we do the same thing in Korea, where we just were completely unaware of the surroundings that we were in at the ground level?
I think so. I mean, from the Cold War perspective, perhaps more often than not, right? That what was most concerning to Americans during the 50s and 60s was containing communism, rather than thinking about these local conflicts as what they were, which was civil wars. And what we did was view these local conflicts as, you know, through a global lens, if you will, right? And not thinking about why the Koreans themselves were fighting, but thinking about how Stalin was, and he wasn't, engineering an assault on American allies in the region. And so I think in both Korea and Vietnam, we're not really all that interested in the well-being of the local people. What we're concerned about is making sure that containment still works, making sure that American credibility and prestige is still relevant to how we view the world and relevant to international relations. And I think a lot of Vietnamese scholars who study the Vietnam conflict from the Vietnamese side are pretty adamant that the United States cared less about the Vietnamese, their South Vietnamese allies, than they did about maintaining credibility and prestige on the world stage from a Cold War perspective.
Yeah. Hard to blame anybody for having that point of view. We've done a good job of going crawfish on a lot of partners in a lot of different ways. I mean, ask the Kurds, and God bless them, they still stand by us, but we've done them dirty several times.
Yeah. There's kind of there's a utility question here, right? When are you no longer useful to the United States? And I've had some conversation with Vietnam era veterans and who were, super and rightfully so supportive of the South Vietnamese cause, were anguished by Americans, and oftentimes they'll blame Congress for kind of turning their back on the government of South Vietnam. But you heard it from the Vietnamese themselves. President Tu saying that the Americans, Kissinger and Nixon, were backstabbing the South Vietnamese people, and were turning against them in their greatest time of need. But the reality was, from a realist perspective, that Vietnam was not really all that important to U.S. foreign policy by the time you get to Nixon's presidency in 69 and 70. That Nixon's trying to re-alter Cold War relationships, and ultimately at the expense of the Vietnamese themselves.
Yeah, you said Vietnam, right? Like, to start filling the blank nations where we've done this. I mean, how reliable of a partner were we in Central and South America? We struggle with these things.
Yeah, and again, that's the fear component of this emotional relationship between faith and fear. Is every time we look south, we do so incredibly fearfully, right? And throughout the Cold War, over and over again, American policymakers on both sides of the aisle are talking about the Western Hemisphere as a beachhead for Soviet expansion, whether it's Cuba or Chile. They're always seeing the possibility of this communist contagion, as they called it, spreading throughout the Western Hemisphere and then bubbling up south into the United States.
We love to run back to our individual talisman, in terms of like what is the thing that guided us, and we look at World War II as this great victory, which it was. But how do we get back to that, back to our roots, right?
Yeah.
But are those roots even valid? Like, I love the conversation, and we're always having it, and let's keep having it, but about female and male fitness standards in an all volunteer force in a free country. And how do we do that? Well, I don't know. I mean, hey, Greg, ask me how many push-ups I've done in a combat fight.
Right.
like zero, right? So
was it more or less the number of pull-ups you did?
I know, right? Yeah. And how many times did I run 3 miles? I never ran 3 miles, So are we even looking at the right standards to go?
No, but again, this isn't new either, right? So I'm teaching a Cold War class at Texas A&M right now. We had a discussion just this week about kind of concerns about American manhood in the early 1950s. And Hanson Baldwin, who is a reporter during much of World War II, covers the war in Korea. I mean, he's the military analyst of the day, right? And he writes this piece in the Saturday Evening Post under the title, "Have America's Fighting Men Gone Soft?" And this is the 1950s, and right, so this concern about an effeminate group of young men incapable of fighting the next war, this is nothing new at all.
Right.
President Kennedy writes a piece in Sports Illustrated about the importance of physical fitness and how that relates to the nation's security. You've got officers talking about the inability of pilots to sustain themselves in the age of jet fighter warfare. You've got, during the Korean War, Americans who became prisoners of war and renounced repatriation and decided to stay in China, which was incredibly disconcerting, right? That they weren't strong enough, not just physically, but morally, to withstand what was then believed to be communist brainwashing. So,
Yeah.
when we heard this kind of diatribe from Secretary Hegseth this week during his lecture to senior officers about the importance of physical fitness, obviously, yes, it's important to be physically fit in a profession of arms, but these concerns about American manhood not being able to sustain the rigors of modern combat are nothing new at all.
Yeah. Yeah, when I'm critical of the Secretary of Defense or War, who the hell am I? But an American, and so I can say that the last Secretary of Defense disappointed me repeatedly, and I don't know that this one's doing any better. They all get to do what they're doing, but every time I hear about more push-ups and pull-ups and that kind of thing, I think, yeah, okay, sure, But if we're fighting a tech fight, I want those guys to be great at tech, and I want to say one more thing. If you're going to put people in the field to engage with locals, they better be professional at working with interpreters.
Right.
You can't ignore these credentials at the expense of push-ups and sit-ups.
No, and I know diversity is a bad word these days. But you do need a diverse skill set in the armed forces, and you're exactly right that again, going back to the Cold War, who was more important to national security, the geeky missileer in a missile silo, or an infantry grunt that was drafted for 18-24 months and potentially served for a tour in Germany, and that was it. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, linguists, cyber folks, drone operators. There's a different level of expertise required for modern warfare that I think, again, not to disparage the importance of physical fitness, but war is not simply about infantry lethality.
Yeah, and there is some required level of fitness, but most every single person that deploys to fill in the blank country, unmasked with the military, sits in a chair for 10 hours a day.
Right.
That is the norm. I mean, even a guy like me, like I'm going to go and I'm going to sit down for hours and hours and hours and write a report and then go out the next day and go out and patrol, so. And I don't know that we figured out what it takes to physically and mentally withstand the rigors of combat in general. And I don't know that we ever will.
Yeah. I mean, as a staff officer, I much rather would have done PT than do PowerPoint slides for a quarterly training briefing, right? So, I mean.
Yeah. Where are my animations?
That's right. Captain, this font doesn't match the font on slide 12. You need to change this.
Captain Daddis, the commander hates blue.
That's right.
That's all these things. Like, am I fighting a war here? Right.
I would have much rather been doing PT than that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's funny. So when we look ahead based upon your history that you've written, like, what do we do? I mean, if we're going to mock Pete Hegseth a little bit here, and he can take it, he's the Secretary of War.
Yeah.
But what should he be saying? Like, I don't mind at all. You kind of call your generals and admiral, all your flag officers, and bring them into one location. Hey, that's military shit. And by the way, everybody, we don't clap and all that. Like, we sit there, we pay attention, professional, So who cares about that? But what should he be saying based upon what you've learned?
I think to that audience, having a conversation that discusses the importance of a coherent grand strategy for the modern era. I still think we have not fully conceptualized an American grand strategy in the post-Cold War, post-GWAT era.
Yeah.
What is the purpose of American grand strategy right now? What are our, not just military objectives, but our global strategic objectives? And how then, as the Secretary of Defense / War, how do we fit into supporting that global agenda that the president is laying out in not only his national security strategy, but in his worldview? And here's what I think we have been doing poorly for the last decade plus of matching ends to means. And here's how I think we can do it better. And I'm going to bring you all together today to lay out some big ideas for how you all need to help me and your president, commander in chief, accomplish these foreign policy objectives.
Right.
And that's what we did not hear. We didn't hear an overarching architecture, a concept of how these senior officers were going to serve U.S. national security interests. This was a National Guard major yelling at a bunch of V6s to get in shape, and I would have much preferred that kind of conversation about what is the proper balance between U.S. interventionism and restraint.
Yeah.
In an increasingly multipolar world, where does the United States fit in? How can we, as senior military leaders, find that sweet spot between competition and conflict when we think about our relationships with other regional powers like China and Russia? And where is that sweet spot where we can compete but not necessarily lead to outright military conflict? And those are the hard questions that I think we all should want our Secretary of Defense, our Secretary of State, our Commander in Chief to be wrestling with, because we are, I think, moving towards this moment in time where, I think even the President and the Secretary of State have said outright that, I'm pretty certain that Rubio has in fact said, we are now moving into a multipolar world.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then what are our grand strategic objectives in that new multipolar world?
Right.
How does the military, the M piece of DIME, fit into all of that? And that's the conversations we should be having, need to be having.
We should be having. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that balance between intervention and restraint or whatever it is. And then there's always, Sherman is always out there holding down his limit on like, listen, you have to get nasty because it's not going to be any easier if you don't. It's going to take 300,000 men. We're going to march south. We're going to kill 200,000 people, and then the fight will stop. Right. We can look at the Israeli-Hamas conflict and two sides that still have will left in them. So there's not been enough imposition of will. And I get mad about the mechanism, but the mechanism has to do something. It has to create that imbalance in will where somebody capitulates.
Yeah, or alternatively, to have an honest conversation about what are the limits of employing military power to solve political, social, cultural questions.
Right.
As I've argued about the American war in Vietnam, when you boil it all down, I think that conflict, that struggle, is won over Vietnamese identity in the modern era. What does it mean to be Vietnamese in the modern era?
Yeah.
And, Pete, that's not a question that Americans can answer.
No.
It's only a question that Vietnamese can answer. Now, is the military piece of that part of how you answer the question? Unfortunately, it was, right? Yeah. But at the end of the day, it was a question of what will this political / national identity look like after colonialism fades away? And so I think one of the reasons why you're seeing such a persistence of conflict in the Israel-Palestinian long war right now is because we are still trying to push military solutions to what is otherwise a political question.
When I think about modern conflict, and these thoughts are always conflicted, and they're all individual balls in a big ocean of balls. So it's hard to get it all to go into one thing. But we don't know how to win socially, culturally, politically, through religion. I mean, we know the military part, just overwhelmed with money and mass, but that doesn't reliably win fights today, right? Because we don't want to do Sherman. We want to be surgical and precise. And that turns into us blowing up weddings or whatever it's going to be. So it's not surgical and precise enough, and it's not leading reliably to victory. At least I didn't write the book. You did. You tell me, but that's what I.
No, but I think if you do look at counterinsurgency, the doctrine that was written in 2006 under the Petraeus team, and then if you go back and look at the counterinsurgency doctrine that was written during the 1960s, there is this assumption that economic and social development will lead to political stability, and that political stability then will cohere that local nation to us.
Yeah.
Those assumptions don't work out all that well. I mean, and we have a political mirror to that here at home, right? Look at all the efforts that the Biden administration put into some of the red states with his transportation plan, right? A lot of money goes into red states. It doesn't create blue votes in those red states, right? So there was an assumption that, development would lead to a better electoral outcome, and that clearly wasn't the case, right? And I think there's something to be said for making some very loose parallels to how we think about or have thought about counterinsurgency in the modern era, right? Just because you provide economic assistance, social assistance, medical assistance to a population, it doesn't mean they're going to throw their lot in with you and against the insurgency.
Yeah, especially when, now fill in the blanks. Like, it's just so many of them. Yeah. It is a very hard thing when you talk about that. Like, oh my gosh. And maybe folks will get this, maybe they won't because they don't have experience like we do. But when you go out into the field and you're going to have what are called key leader engagements, everybody is a key leader engagement according to us. So there is no just leader engagements. There is no doctrinal person who's like, I am an expert in these engagements, and here's how we're going to prepare for that. Matter of fact, the guy that runs the KLE program is the guy that runs fires at the brigade level of everybody. So brigade's 5,000 people. And so that means there's probably a major who's super smart, probably trained at Harvard or MIT, great with numbers. And he is great at putting 155 artillery rounds on a target miles and miles away. And this guy is now crossed over into human engagement. Right. They're calling that fires. I'm going to tell you right now, those guys are brilliant, but that does not reliably in a year-long deployment produce the kind of engagements, the kind of mapping that has to happen to get this buy-in. And let me say one more thing about the buy-in thing. And this is where I'm really critical of all of the modern coin expert. I'm not an anti-coin guy, but here's where we miss the mark. It's like, we got to win them hearts and minds. No. You're trying to establish a government. And if there is no state, there is no government. We are a net destabilizer. And the fact that I say that and people reject it, it's like, yes, that's right, because we're still a net destabilizer. You rejecting it doesn't make it not true. And it's our responsibility if we're going to stabilize a place. It doesn't matter if they like us. It matters that they like their government. And if they don't, then we should go. We shouldn't be there because we refuse to be professionally capable at those tasks.
Yeah, and what I found when I was doing research for this book is that oftentimes American interventionism exacerbated local conflict rather than solve them. You saw it throughout the Middle East in the 1950s and 1960s when we intervened. You clearly saw it in Southeast Asia, and obviously I think you've seen it more recently in the Middle East. There's another piece to this, Pete, that I think is important, and as you well know, it's the difficulty of kind of tying together tactical successes into some type of operational and then most importantly strategic momentum.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And it's the hardest. I'm not so sure we ever figured that out in both Iraq and Afghanistan. You may have a brigade or a regiment that was making some progress in a province, and then turning that into some type of larger momentum. I'm not sure we ever figured that equation out all that well.
No, I'm here to tell you we never did, and we still haven't. And every unit that would show up would have it's not just 20 individual one-year fights. It was total amnesia about what might have happened before. And so we would, like an insane, crazy, we'll say girlfriend in this case, that would show up, but you're like, what are you doing back here again? You know, like it was over and over again, like, hello, I'm back. Or here's what we're going to do. And then it would say the same thing the last 10 units had said. And the person is like, are you certifiable? What are you doing? And we have guns.
We had a good friend that just visited this week, and a classmate of mine from West Point served 3 tours in Iraq over a 5-year period.
Yeah.
Never went back to the same place.
Right. So why would you?
Why would you? So, even for somebody's experiences, whose first deployment right out of the gate was Desert Storm, served in Eastern Europe during the 1990s, highly professional officer.
Yeah.
And even on his third tour, when he's got experience in Iraq, he still has to go through a huge learning curve because it wasn't where he was the first two deployments. And again, you saw something similar with that in Vietnam as well, right? We fought, we fought multiple wars one year after the next, and they never amounted to a singular war.
Right. Yeah, I've said this in the show before, but it bears repeating. I was valuable in part because I would often stay in an area for a while, and then the unit would rotate over the top of me,
right?
And I would be able to slightly speed up their coming about to go in a different direction. But that took me learning how to also, no matter where I ended up, whatever, it didn't matter the country. We were the biggest problem, and so yes, I'm trying to prevent bombs from going off and everything else. But the biggest thing I did working combat spy side was to get us to be less of a problem. How do I help the commander lose less?
Right.
Like people would say, you're trying to find a needle on a haystack. Okay, that's great. I don't know why that guy's always from the South or Texas when I say this thing. I'm like, but there's a field of needles over there to the boss. And he's like, go get me all the needles you can because I need to know how to run my machine better.
Right.
And those guys never felt like they had enough of that information. They never said, Pete, you've given me enough negative things to fix here in the unit. Like, no, more. I mean, I had commanders kicking assets out of their battle space because as enablers, they were disabling him. They were causing disruptions. They were behind the unit. It's like, you're not valuable to me. Send your PSYOP team home.
Right.
And this is that linking the strategic and the tactical and all these things. And then what tasks specifically do you need to get good at?
Yeah, so, and then there's a domestic component to this. I think that I've found interesting over this long post World War II era was that even given that historical record, whether it's in Korea or Vietnam or the Middle East, we still struggle with the possibility that there are limits to American power overseas.
Right.
And so there's a domestic political component to this, right? That I'm not going to run for my congressional seat in my local district by running a campaign on saying, I believe in the limits of American power. I'm not going to win an election on that.
Yeah.
So we kind of have this, we place this faith in military force, even though the historical record shows over and over again that it's really difficult to manage this in a way that's productive.
Yeah. And we ask a lot of these people who come and they learn how to engineer or they learn how to whatever. And these leaders are now doing something totally different. My favorite example is you send a bunch of tankers to Afghanistan and, and everybody, you guys don't know this, their motto is death before dismount.
Right.
And the very first thing they do is dismount and they don't touch their tanks. So how are they supposed to succeed? Right. So I guess the question when I was building up earlier, what I wanted to ask you is if I was to go and help out a battalion commander in 1946, 51, and just go every 5 years down the line, am I gonna have the same level of success in engaging with them now that I know how to speak commander? And are they gonna have a similar challenge with reliably accomplishing whatever their mission is? Because our connections between our theory and our tactics is there isn't one.
Yeah, and I think the challenge of that, if you do that like every 5 years, the character of war is rapidly changing over time, right?
Good point.
For the most part, a fairly conventional type of fight in World War II, but there is a level of complexity in the sense of doing no-kidding joint operations between air, sea, and land, and then working alongside allies. Very quickly, the Army and Air Force in particular are now wrestling with how do I operate and survive in the atomic era. And then all of a sudden we're starting to do counterinsurgency in 1960s and thinking about using military force as a nation building effort. And then we go into the 1980s and we're not sure as we're sending peacekeepers to Beirut, if that is part of our skill set or not.
Right.
The 1990s blows everything up because the Cold War is over and we don't even know who our enemy is anymore. And so I think the challenge with all this is that the nature of war may be consistent, but over this time period that I looked at, the character was always rapidly changing. And so every time you place your faith in this type of war, it changes, which then rises your fear level. And then you have to re-emphasize faith in a different type of conflict and a different type of war. And we're seeing that right now, right? We are not all that adept, I don't think yet, of thinking about how best to coordinate and synchronize. Got to throw synchronize in here at some point, right? Synchronize, more conventional types of conflict with cyber as just one example, right?
And again, using my frame of reference, because I think it's illustrative. It tells a story of what you're talking about here. In the 90s, we had a thing called the Mission Essential Task List, the medal.
Yeah. Right.
And there were, and I'm an E4, so I'm looking at this thing and I'm trying to do my best to be the best. And I'm like, I don't even know what some of these things are. How am I going to become proficient in all these tasks and master counterintelligence, which is another gigantic, depends on what unit you're in, what era, constantly. I don't know if all MOSs are that different, but it was dramatically different. And so you couldn't develop any kind of mastery on anything. And even something as simple as alert, assemble, upload.
Right.
If you don't practice that, it erodes. And so it's, on its face, it's an impossible, ridiculous circumstance to train in all these individual tasks. And here I am screaming about what tactics do we have to master to feed the strategy machine all these wins, right?
Yeah, we had a nice buzzword though with full spectrum operations. So we did have that. So
yeah. And so any era is going to struggle with this stuff at some point. So how do we know if maybe this is good enough?
I don't think you do. I think, there is something to be said for, focusing on the basics of blocking and tackling, right? That in trying to adjust. You heard that, I think, throughout much of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the best way to train for these complex operations was just to focus in on blocking and tackling. Yeah. But at the same time, then you heard from critics like John Gentile, who's kind of one of the critics of counterinsurgency theory, that we were in the process of placing so much emphasis on counterinsurgency, losing basic skill sets like I'm an armor officer and I don't know how to shoot my tank anymore. What are the implications going to be if we no longer are fighting counterinsurgency and are asked as a nation to fight a different type of conflict? And
we talk about ethics quite a lot in the military. We have a whole center for it and everything.
Right.
But the commander's ethos is to, train hard so we don't spill blood later on. But that's not the fight offered. Right. But if you don't train for that and that fight is offered, all of a sudden it's like, well, what the hell were you doing? Like, the very basic thing. There's other stuff too. Like when we do try to do joint and combined, and we have, and look, you've probably seen it. I know I have a bunch. When you have that foreign officer sit down right next to the boss, because they're the same damn rank, and we treat that foreign person like they're a piece of shit or they don't exist. And I've never heard of a scenario where a brigade goes to NTC and their Jordanian colonel wins the war for them.
Right.
They've never learned that lesson. And so they never consider the value of that person's mastery of Islam.
So I was, my personal story for this is I was serving in the multinational Corps Iraq and my MNCI headquarters in 2009. And there was a liaison cell for the Iraqi army. And some of these folks, because they had served under Saddam Hussein, were then obviously suspect. And I just kind of wandered in the office one day and started talking with one of the senior officers. Well, come to find out, he had gone to Sandhurst as a young officer.
Right.
And we never talked to him. Right. We never talked to him because he was somehow, suspect because of his personal and professional history in under the Saddam regime, and lost out, I think, on a lot of opportunity to get some local insights about the war in which we were fighting.
There was in 2009 someone who I think was a full colonel was writing a mocking email basically every day, mocking our partners in an email that anybody had access to, that I got sent to me. I mean, you just end up reading it. I'm saying email, maybe it was a post or something, but they would do they would mock their ability to do an operations order.
Right.
And it went public. Someone finally leaked it out, and I'm like, good, because that person's shitty, and this is a person who knows better to put something that in an open forum, like anywhere on our thing. I don't know if you recall that, but yeah, Iraqis did things differently, and we were trying to get them to do it better. Okay, great. In an active war zone, this is not
Right.
a field problem, and so all of this goes into all of that. And you're right. I mean, Sandhurst, come on, right? Like maybe they have something to offer, and then how hard would they pull if you let them be great at something?
Yeah, and again, this goes back to my earlier point about the relationship between war and cultural meaning. This is also a society that is trying to figure out what its own identity is in the post-Saddam era.
Right.
And we're giving them shit because they can't fill out an op order, as they're trying to figure out, like, what is my role in society, and what does this society actually look like when it's no longer under a dictatorship?
Right.
And then we're getting, we're smug about the fact that they can't write a 5-paragraph op order.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're like, what do I need 5 paragraphs for? I'm just going to tell Jeff to go this way and tell Muhammad to go that way and swap spots. That's all we're going to do.
You don't need 5 paragraphs. What you need is about 16 appendices that go on top of those 5 paragraphs. That's what's really important.
I've coded this operation black because it's a war zone, or how about redlining? We're going to redline this because it's a war zone, and someone's like, and we're going anyhow. And you're like, I just thought you said this was so dangerous, we shouldn't do it.
Right.
And then we go. The idea for this book, where did it come from?
A lot of it came from my PhD advisor. I was finishing up my time at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was ultimately heading to West Point to teach there. And he kind of pulled me aside and said, look, if you're going to go teach at West Point, you think you might be there for a while. And if you're going to stay in academia, you might want to think about writing a big idea book. And he meant, not a big book, but a big idea, and, wrestle with a big problem.
Yeah.
And I kept that in the back of my head for a long time. And the big idea for me was wrestling with this big question of what has our relationship with war been like? And as I started to think about that question and look back on the historical record, I'd written a little bit about our faith that we place in war. And I had written a short piece in Military Review a long time ago on fear and its impact on military units. And then I kind of thought, well, maybe there is something to be seen here in terms of the tension between the two. And I didn't like really doing tactical level military history. I didn't really like doing international relations theory. And I've increasingly been interested in the kind of relationships between war and American society. And that's kind of what led me to this thinking about what really is a dysfunctional relationship that we've had with war since the end of the Second World War.
Everybody, the link for the book is down below. You see that on Amazon. You guys know how to do this stuff, but fantastic. I love this conversation. I love just digging into these nuts and bolts, because there's so much, as much as we're kind of bashing on the military in general, all of our experiences and everything, there's a lot of people who are hyper smart, who are always trying to improve, and they are trained specifically in their field, and they're world class. And so when we say this, it's a kind of critique we can give ourselves, because we all know that we can find a way to be better.
I think it's some of the very best organizations I've worked in, some of the best leaders I've seen, some of the best, very best people I've come in contact with have been through my service in the military. And it is an organization that, as you mentioned earlier about the generals not clapping, that there's something beautiful about it being an apolitical, nonpartisan organization. Right. There is something to be said for an organization that doesn't think about service as a cliche, that it is meaningful for a lot of people in the ranks. It's an organization, I think, that is centered on as much as possible being effective and efficient simultaneously. There's a lot of good to military service, obviously, and I think the criticism comes from a place of love, right? That
for sure.
Want us to be better at about how we think about war, because of the consequences, and
how you think about better and how I think about better. All these ideas compete as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny. So for anybody who's watching, when the boss walks in, someone in that room said, "The President of the United States," and then en masse, boom, everybody stood up at the same time. That's their version of clapping. We are all on this team. We all understand who the boss is. We're all at the position of attention. And then someone said, take seats. And that's a command. And they all sat down.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about. It wasn't about political. It wasn't about service. It wasn't about anything other than here comes the boss. He's going to talk. We're going to listen. And then we're all going to try to figure out what that means to us and our mission.
No, and I think what the challenge, I think, for us in a democracy, I think we're still in democracy, right? Is that, those examples should not breed a form of consensus among the electorate, right? That we should, in many ways we don't, think more deeply about these questions of war and the relationship between war and diplomacy in our national security strategy. And, I like to say that dissent is not dishonorable. We should be dissenting and having, thoughtful, engaged debates that are mature and respectful, because this is really important stuff.
Yeah. And rigor is not an attack.
Right.
Like a demand for rigor is like, hey, you got to do better. I mean, if I was going to go on a patrol and the person I was working with, they're in my field, they're always going to be less capable than me because I have more experience. So either they're willing to learn and get better, and I'm going to give them all the rope they need to go out and do a mission, and then help guide them. It's fine. Like, we're going to do that. But if they weren't, then I wouldn't have them go out, because it's too much on the line for these things. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the folks that can withstand that kind of learning, they do better. Mm-hmm. Did you know, you guys probably didn't 100% overlap, but did you know Xander Bullock when you were at the academy?
No.
Okay. Yeah. It's a big world, but you guys probably had some overlap time, but you would have been upperclassman probably when he was lower. Anyhow, I always think about if you took the class of 1989, whatever it's going to be, and you asked them and you wrote a book that they all like, this is what I think, like, there'd be a powerful message on all of those combined experiences in career, especially now at this point when everybody's either just about done or has been done for a while.
Yeah.
And what did that mean, and how well were they prepared? And it's just so many points of view from so many brilliant careers, from so many brilliant people. I appreciate you taking on the even bigger picture of doing that. It's inspiring to know that there's folks out there trying to help us be better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything you want to say in closing before we wrap this up? And thanks for hanging out with me, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. This has been great. I really enjoyed it. No, I think I think part of the message of the book is that we have to do better about testing our assumptions when it comes to war. I think this book is important because this relationship between faith and fear can lead to a spiraling of effort, and the result is a militarization of American foreign policy, which is, I don't think, healthy for us as a republic. And I think the message here is that if we continue to believe that war is the only instrument of power that can solve our problems overseas or more recently here at home, then again, that's just not a healthy place to be. And we have to be more critical about thinking over matters on this larger, deeper relationship we have with war.
Man, that's fair, right? Like, we have to. Well, we should always be thinking deeper about this stuff and spending time reading text. Make sure you guys get Greg's book. I always say buy two, buddy read. If you got a book club, this is what helps out authors, is by helping expand their voice. You find a book you like, hand it to somebody, do a book club, whatever it is, because it's awful hard to get your message out there. And you all are pouring your lives into these things. Every word is important. And I appreciate the time that you've taken. I know how hard it is to sell books. I've talked to a lot of authors. No one's like, oh, selling books is easy. No one.
Yeah, that's a hard part, right?
Yeah. Anything in closing, anything you want to ask me that we haven't covered at all?
No, this has been great. I really enjoyed it, Pete. Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about this. I think it's important, obviously, and I really appreciate you giving me a platform to have this conversation.
Right. Anytime. Everybody, go check out Greg's book, and I will talk to you all next week.
All right. Thanks, Pete. Take care.